Probably not, but at any rate, we digress.
Yes.
Well, this is great. So you've been exploring kind of the language of scoring.
Yeah,
Um,
and the way my experience is that timing and that stuff is not as difficult as the language of scoring because most of these people have been writing music just abstract for abstract purposes. In other words, just to
sure.
write a piece of music as opposed to this has to help tell the story.
Right. I completely understand. Well, can I,
Yep.
should I just, can I
Well,
freestyle a bit?
yeah, we can freestyle, and then I've got a few questions. But yeah, why don't you freestyle? So Jeff's in his space in Los Angeles,
I'm here
and
in Los
is the
Angeles.
same space that I visited.
Um, Sorry?
The same space I visited.
Yeah,
It's at your
actually,
house.
now that you mention it.
It's at your house, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I moved my studio back into my house. I was working out of a commercial studio for many, many years. And I used to share a studio with Hans Zimmer and Harry Gregson Williams and John Powell and a few other crazy people. And but this is far better. So listen, first of all, Pete, thank you for inviting me. Hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to meet you all. And I think it's fantastic. I kind of want to say really just one or two little things, and then we can just have a dialogue of whatever you want to talk about. But I, I, I want to kind of reflect on something that Pete said a minute ago, which is that most of you are already very, very familiar with writing music because you've been writing jazz or other musical forms, right? So if I were to ask you, what is film music? What would you say?
Hmm.
And for the sake of argument, I'm not going to make a differentiation between film, television, and even video games. And if you want to talk about the differentiations later, we can. But how would you guys say film music is different than some other kind of music, or is it?
Can I answer this?
Sure, Lucas.
I feel like it's a way to enhance the emotions of what's portrayed on the screen. That's how I've always seen it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Isn't country music also there to enhance the emotions of the people listening?
I think they're both similar. Like they're both music. Music has always been a way to just express your emotions and how you feel, and I feel like it's the same towards a film. I don't see it as any different.
All right. Are you saying that it's about the composer expressing their emotions?
No, it's the composer writing out what the film producer intended just to help intensify what people will see in the
Mm-hmm.
audience.
Can anybody point to anything else that might in some way differentiate what scores are versus concert music or pop music or dance music or anything like that, or jazz?
Well, can I answer?
Yes.
There's music for film is quite varied because it just depends on the need of the film, the collaboration with the director and the writers, and so it a lot of times it ends up being just supportive role, but it can be a very uh, role that like sets the film apart beyond what it would have been without the music. Like, I can't imagine Star Wars without the music that's there. Or I mean, go back to Sergei Eisenstein and Sergei Prokofiev, the two of them collaborating together, making Alexander Nevsky, just absolutely fantastic collaboration. So there's a wide variety of film composition, and serves different roles for different composers and directors.
So, very good. So, if I hypothetically, if I played a piece of instrumental music, um, do you think most of you could tell whether or not that was from a film score, if assuming it's a piece you'd never heard before, could you tell if it was from a film score versus being from a composition that somebody wrote for concert use? Is there something that might make you think that, oh yeah, this sounds like a score and not like classical concert music or jazz or pop or EDM or ambient or experimental or anything like that?
Sometimes there's odd phrasing. Sometimes there's just different uses of time. That's the only thing that would clue me in, personally.
Sometimes I feel like there's not like a strong melody, and that the music is just to create an environment and not distract from what's happening visually.
You're talking about a score versus concert music. Or are you saying the other way around?
No, I'm saying in one differentiation. Like if you just played us some music and I heard something that didn't have a strong melody but sounded more kind of atmospheric, I would think that might be film music rather than a concert score.
I guess. I mean, there are a ton of film scores that are highly thematic, melodic, very much in that world of extremely linear melodic music.
Actually, we've been working on motivic composing in and using that as the basis of our compositions that we've been writing. So as you know very well, motives are incredibly important in film music. Being able to say something in absolutely being able to say something in 4 or 5 notes or 3 notes, and have people come back to those characters.
Mm-hmm. Well, all of this is to kind of bring up what our job is as people writing scores. And Lucas, I think, has it very, very right in many ways that we are storytellers. That the job of a movie or a TV show or a video game soundtrack in general is to tell a story. I stop short of using a term like enhance the emotion, because I've worked with many directors who did not want me to enhance emotion, nor is it necessarily purely a supportive art form, that it's about staying under. In fact, within most projects, there are moments of all of the above. There are times when scores are very thematic, and there are times when they become very atmospheric. There are times when it is very in the foreground, and there are times when you barely even notice it. So if you average all that together, the fact is that music has a role in modern entertainment that's extremely unique. And often where some people struggle, especially if you've come out of other genres of music, is that there are some very unique things about writing to picture. Writing to picture is very much a unique art form. If you just think of it like that, that's a big deal. But at the same time, a really good score is thinking 20 steps forward and 10 steps back. A good score often can help connect dots. Does that make sense? By the way, I'm sorry about if you can hear the noise outside, but there's they're gardening in there's a gardener next door. So it'll be gone in the next 5 minutes or so. Thinking of music purely from the perspective of storytelling and separating it completely from genre or style is a big deal. I've seen people struggle with the idea of writing a piece of music that has to be 23 and a half seconds. That really does create a challenge. And a lot of people end up trying it and kind of failing because they just, take a pair of scissors and say, okay, on to the next phrase, or, oh, I'll wrap up early and sit around for 3.5 beats, and then move on. So there definitely is something about the lovely structure of editing, of storytelling through edits, that becomes a fairly major part of how we do what we do. As you probably know, when editors are cutting picture, they often will put on some temp music, because cutting picture to silence, you rarely meet an editor who enjoys cutting to silence. They need something, anything, to give a sense of how this scene is going to work once you've added music. And one of the things that music always does is it changes the audience's perception of time. It can speed it up and it can slow it down. So it can speed it up for an action scene that wouldn't be as exciting without the music. It can slow it down if all you're trying to do is create tension and you're trying to make a scene unbearably uncomfortable to the audience and you know, the ticking clock. And whether you do it through kind of traditional thematic melodic things, or you do it motivically, you know, Stravinsky had a really bold sense of what the word melody meant, because he thought of his music as very melodic. It's just that his melodies were incredibly fragmented and obtuse and moved around the orchestra, you know, like crazy. So it comes down to the idea that all good music draws your attention to something in the front, something in the middle, and something in the back. You know, primary, secondary, and tertiary thinking. And then in scoring, you add one more element, which is the movie itself, which is the fact that if the music distracts from dialogue, it's gone. If it tells the audience, depending on who the director is, if it tells the audience what to think or feel, that's a problem. But mainly, music does function almost the way a concerto kind of wraps itself around the solo, where the soloist is playing and the music kind of, the bed kind of retracts back and then they trade places. So it's a lovely balance. But ultimately, for me as a composer, the two things that are most important to me are focus and economy. Focus meaning, what does the audience need to listen to right this second? Is it dialogue, or is it me? Is it the helicopter? Is it the cellos? And economy, which is that you really want to say as much as possible with the least amount. Even John Williams has those moments where his music steps forward, but then it retreats back quite a lot. He's very, very good at that. And remember that when you go out and listen to a soundtrack album, those albums are highly edited. They've cut out a lot of the drony, simple accompaniment things and focus in on, you know, kind of those, you know, crowd-pleasing elements that make listening to a soundtrack enjoyable. I've edited, you know, countless soundtracks for myself, and actually for years I used to cut all of Hans Zimmer's soundtracks, and there was a ton of stuff that stayed behind so that you got to have all the good bits. But in the actual scores themselves, there's quite a lot of exposition and moments where you kind of just take it easy and chill out. So I guess the whole thing is to say that regardless of who you are and where you come from as a musician, it is about storytelling. And if you're good at it, your job is to help complete and fulfill the vision of the director, but do it with some surprises. You know, directors are incredibly familiar with all of the technical skills that go into filmmaking. A good director and many great producers, they understand screenwriting and how to structure a story and how to structure a scene and the acts and the sub-acts and the transitions. They understand cinematography and lenses and lighting and color and costuming and set design, and they understand the psychology of editing, and they understand CGI, and they understand a lot about dialogue and sound. Where they almost always come up short is very few directors are also musicians. There's a couple, but they are by far the exception. So the relationship that a composer has with a film is really highly unique. It is, it requires a little more mutual respect and understanding. It's more of a conversation. Directors can say to an editor, take that shot and switch them, and then shorten that shot by about a second and a half. And boom, there, they just said something, and that person can then execute that in seconds or minutes. But with a composer, what can they say? You know, I think this piece of music is building too fast. I think this piece of music doesn't express enough about the conflict. I think this piece of music isn't dramatic enough for the scene, or it's too dramatic for the scene. Does that make sense? So learning a language where we as composers can make their vision come true, be actualized, but do it in a way where they can't explain it, is both a treat and a challenge. So that's kind of just a way of kind of framing what it is we do. From there, it's kind of amazing what we can get away with in terms of genre, style, experimentation, simplicity, complexity at times. You know, we get if we have a good, if the people making the project are good, we get a lot of opportunities, and it's sort of, you know, for us to step up and inject our vision into somebody else's vision. I really do believe that it's very true that there are very few stories out there. You know, people say there's only 5 stories. You know, there's the love story, there's the hero's journey, and a few others, but there's an infinite number of ways to tell those stories. And, you know, television in 2020 looks nothing like television looked 10 years ago. And the music has completely changed, and video game music has completely changed. And even film scoring has evolved a fair amount. It's gotten far more eclectic and far more experimental. And a lot of unique voices are now part of the community of people doing scores. You know, for me, I consider every project I do to be, you know, a series of challenges of trying to do something new, but within the context of who I am. You know, I'm starting a Netflix movie now that's kind of a romantic comedy, sort of. But I'm also starting a video game that's incredibly dark and aggressive. They're both me. They both have really unique challenges, but you know, as composers, having a sense of being eclectic and being a bit of a chameleon is generally viewed as a positive within reason. So what do you guys want to talk about?
I got into writing music for picture from doing production music work and library stuff. I wrote for Killer Tracks back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then I started getting independent films and then documentaries and then sports themes and all that stuff. And I got into it, you know, from that aspect of it. And you had a totally different journey. And I'd like, and that's, I think, is important for people to see that there's no one way to get into the community.
Oh, I don't know 2 people who have, you know, found careers the same way. Some people have connections, some don't. Some people are really good at making introductions, some aren't. I spent a lot of years as a studio musician working on in pop music. So I was working with record producers. And that was as a synth programmer, drum machine programmer, working with, technology. And I was good at it, and there was a need for it, and it was long enough ago where it was a lot harder. And so, I had a skill that was helpful to other people. So I got my start kind of in the record industry, in pop music, and then eventually I found that I was working with a lot of film and TV composers, and doing the same thing as a programmer. But what was interesting was that I started getting these opportunities to do ghostwriting. And there's about a period of about 4 years where I was really just ghostwriting on tons of TV shows and movies. So, my name wasn't on it, but that was music school for me right there. It was so beneficial to be at these meetings because, they knew I was there. They knew I was a part of the process. So, I got to be at meetings that went really well. I got to be at meetings that went very poorly. I wrote pieces that they loved, and I wrote pieces that they hated, but everything was incredibly educational. And those composers really became like mentors to me. And by the time I started to get opportunities to write with, under my own name, I had already been doing it for enough years, and I kind of understood the hustle and the pace and the language and the expectations and the politics and the psychology and the do's and don'ts of being in the middle of a project when it was going well, and especially when it was going poorly. So that was really kind of my upbringing, was to just work on other people's scores for a long time, and then jump in. And I started off doing TV mostly. I scored just buckets. I've scored a few hundred episodes of TV.
And then the other thing is, there's two other bits. The first bit is, as a composer, how well do you have to understand technology, using a sequencer, being able to do mixing on your
Sure. Well, I mean, let me ask you this: as a concert pianist, how well do you need to know how to play the piano? Our ability to express ourselves is tied directly to our ability to produce. And honestly, every composer really is wearing two very distinct hats: the composer hat and the producer hat. Nobody pays you to write music. They pay you to produce a master recording that you hand in. Now, to what extent you collaborate with an engineer who knows how to record strings, sure. You don't need to know how to mic up a French horn section. You don't necessarily need to know how to mix a live session, but inevitably, the process is that you were going to write music at a computer and then deliver demos that will just be what you wrote on the computer before you bring in live players. Sometimes, like actually the movie I'm doing right now, I added a few soloists to my synth palette just because it's very acoustic music. The end result's going to be very acoustic. So I have a guitar player and a couple other musicians, a fiddle player, and my ability to create a reasonably good sounding demo is pretty important. And then the other thing, of course, is we live in a world where there are no excuses. And you're competing with every other composer alive, including me. And so your ability to make your music sound as good as it can is pretty critical. It's not about writing little dots on paper. even if what you're doing is writing dots on paper. You need to be really, really, really good producers. And the good news is that there are an infinite number of YouTube videos that can show you how to do a lot of it. I mean, it doesn't replace practice. It doesn't replace having a mentor or a gifted teacher like you do. But I consider my studio to be my instrument. And, you know, my sequencer and my plugins and my samples and my synths and my programming and my effects all matter. And I know how to craft them to sound like what I want it to sound like. My demos are about 80% of the way to the final. And that's kind of just assumed now. That's been assumed for like 30 years. You know, I mean, this is not new stuff. It's gotten easier, it's gotten cheaper, it's gotten better to be able to produce orchestral music or other kinds of, you know, synthetics, you know, simulations of, you know, computer simulations of live players. Or for that matter, if you're interested in doing very electronic music, you know, the sophistication of the tools is fantastic. It's great. So, and still getting better, you know? So yeah, knowing your studio, knowing your computer, knowing your software, so that it doesn't slow you down. You know, when I'm at it, I'm just, you know, I'm not thinking about technology when I'm writing. I am just thinking about music. And you know, you can't see what I'm seeing and, you know, how my studio is laid out, but I have these touch screens and these faders, and I can, you know, do editing and what have you, you know, as fast as I can think of it, because it's important to me. Good ideas kind of have a high infant mortality rate. You know, you can't stop and read the manual. You can't stop and figure, you know, this shit out any more than a concert pianist can, you know, stop and figure out where E flat is on the keyboard. I am personally a composer who mostly gets hired to do electronic music, and it's what I'm best known for, both in TV and in games and film. So, you know, most of my projects tend to have a dominant amount of electronics, but I've also written quite a few scores that are just orchestra or rhythm section or some hybrid. Again, it all starts in the computer. I don't think there's a way around it.
Yeah, I remember reading an article you wrote, I think it was for Keyboard Magazine, where you talked about you had a recording session at Abbey Road, and you had to pack up your technology and ship it to London.
Back in the day, yeah. I, you know, used to have hardware, and so I had 20 samplers. You know, now that you can basically whatever I did back then is, you know, would work just fine on my phone.
Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is we're about the same age, and we've seen the industry change, and we're at a place now that, as you said, is much different than even 5 or 10 years ago. And do you have any thoughts on where you see this medium moving in the future? Like, what trends do you see?
I think the main thing is you just see a lot more, a far more diverse field of people being asked to write music and bring what they do. You know, film scoring started off where composers were actually full-time employees at studios like Fox or MGM or Warner Brothers. And it was a full-time job, and you just worked for that one company. And you were, you know, today you're doing a Western, and tomorrow you're doing a romance, and the next day you're doing science fiction. And you were sort of expected to be somebody who could do a bit of everything. Now we have composers as diverse as Trent Reznor and Philip Glass and Tan Dunn and Carter Burwell and Elliot Goldenthal and Stuart Copland and M83 and Onetrix Point Never, who get hired to score films because they're great musicians who do interesting music, who have figured out how to score a picture one way or another, but only do what they do. You know, nobody goes to Trent Reznor and says, hey, could you write something in the style of? You hire him to do that thing that he does for your movie, and you talk about it and you think, well, what if this and what if that? But that's something that's fairly different. You know, guys like, you know, composers like Hildur Guttendotter or Max Richter or Olafur Arnolds, or when he was alive, Johan Johansson, were these fascinating musical figures who brought something very personal. Now, what's interesting, though, is with a lot of these people, whether they also did concert music, you know, Tan Dunn and Elliot Goldenthal and Ryuichi Sakamoto, they have a life in the concert world, or recording, you know, having a recording career, doing something that's very much not score. And what's interesting is that there's a high level of trust, such that when they sit down to score a film, they adapt who they are into the language of film, exactly like we were talking about at the beginning of the talk. So what Tan Dunn does for an Ang Lee movie is incredibly different than the fact he's also an opera composer. You know, Terence Blanchard has had a great career as a jazz musician, but when he writes for Spike Lee, he brings a completely different skill set. It's still the same guy, so, you know, speaks the same language, but he has done it in a completely different way. So I think where things have been going is a far more diverse group of musicians are now being asked to do work. I worked on a video game recently, and they hired Run the Jewels to do some tracks. Cool. I mean, original for the game. It goes on and on. It's pretty great, and the influence of EDM and ambient music and so-called post-classical music and contemporary classical music, which has sort of moved heavily towards that post-classical kind of, you know, super tonal, simple stuff, works really well in film. And so there's just a lot more kinds of seats at the table. Naturally, all of these people are really good producers and self-producers. So it's, there's rarely, I mean, you know, there's some exceptions. Trent Reznor never writes to picture. When somebody hires Trent Reznor, he basically sits down and writes an album. And then a music editor says, well, let's try this in this scene and this in this scene. I mean, Trent Reznor, you know, got the Academy Award for The Social Network, probably never having seen The Social Network, or at least not the final version of it. And you know what? I don't have a problem with that. Great score, you know, one of those very trendy scores that got imitated 1,000 times and ended up in 1,000 temp scores. You know, The Social Network for years, you know, kind of, you know, took the mantle from Tom Newman, who, you know, for a while every temp score was Tom Newman, and then for a little while all the temp score after Drive, all the temp scores were Cliff Martinez. And so, you know, these things come up. Max Richter is you know, become a little more valued for bringing a unique sound. So, you know, in a way, it's about a broader range of unique styles of music, but at the same time, always applying it to what it takes to make music work in a film, which for me tends to be focus and economy. Do what you do, but strip it down to its basics, its essentials, take out everything that isn't tremendously valuable in that moment, and then kind of understand as much about the arc of storytelling in that medium as you can.
Interesting. So I think that that's incredibly valuable, because it basically is saying that while you have to make your music work with the picture, there is room for individuality, and that there's more of that. People are being hired because they've got a unique voice to add, and they're being hired for that, to do that with the picture.
I think more than ever, really. Look, don't get me wrong. Composers, and really good, unique composers, are asked to imitate, oh, I love that cue in that thing. I love that you score. Can you do something like that? It's in fact, that has become even, bolder than it used to be. But I've never heard of a composer able to establish a career based on how well they wrote sounding like another established composer. I can't think of anybody, maybe one or two people, because they could sound like Hans Zimmer, but that was like 20 years ago. And they used to write for Hans Zimmer. So, yeah, sometimes when you submit a demo, somebody may say, well, what do you, send me some music that's kind of ambient, as, kind of like so-and-so and so-and-so. But I've never heard of a composer having a career, or even starting a career, without bringing something of themselves to the table and being a good storyteller at the same time.
So that's an interesting point, and that's not contradictory with being versatile.
Oh, no,
right.
it's not. I mean, look, Tom Newman is a very versatile composer. He can do some really different things, and they all sound like Tom Newman. And he got his, he became established because he actually broke away from the Newman sound and did something very personal with American Beauty and a couple other films, kind of back to back, that established him as a unique sound. But then he could turn around and do a Pixar movie and a James Bond movie, and quote James Bond themes, and do all that super testosterone-y stuff, and do those Steve Soderbergh movies where he's super kind of enigmatic, but entirely different than the other things he did. And yeah, he's a very versatile guy who absolutely you can recognize one of his scores, usually within moments.
Yeah. So individuality and versatility work together. I think
I think so.
Yeah.
Some composers are asked to be versatile, some are not. But nobody's ever asked to be a jack of all trades, master of none.
Let's open it up to some questions from some of the attendees.
Yeah.
Anybody have?
By the way, I'm good for a while. Good.
I'm curious. I'm curious what kind of music you listen to. If you work with music all day and it's your
Chris.
job, do you listen to music, and where do you find things to listen to that inspire you?
I do listen to music. Not a ton. I go through periods where I might be doing research on a project. So I might listen to music of a particular region or time or style. For pleasure, I tend to listen to pretty chill electronic stuff just to like chill out. So listen to a lot of ambient stuff, and when I put out my own music, it's often more like that. And I'm just putting the final touches on a new album that's pretty ambient. So people recommend things. I've been working with this rapper who said, "Hey, we were talking about a style of music called witch house." And has anybody ever heard of witch house?
Nope.
There's its most notable artist is a Venezuelan transgender artist by the name of Arca, who's unbelievable. But then my friend turned me on to this artist who goes by the name of DJ Heroin, and the music blew me away, and I listened to it kind of nonstop. An album called Sanguine and an album called Skinless for a couple of weeks. A week. So, I listen to a lot of weird shit, go in and out of different things. Don't really listen to a lot of pop, But I'll put on playlists. I go to Spotify and I'll just put on a new releases thing. I also own a music production company that does production music. And as such, my team, and there's 5 of us, are constantly listening to trailers and commercials and reality shows, promos, sports networks, and kind of discussing what's going on musically because trends change pretty quickly. And we put out about 25 to 30 albums a year in all kinds of styles. I don't write very much of it, but it's pretty important for me to kind of know all of those worlds pretty deeply. So yeah, if I wasn't a musician, I'd probably listen to a lot more music.
We have a lot of students here who are studying with Mike Mossman, who's an incredible big band arranger. How much of that kind of music do you run into, not in the stuff that you do, but just the need for people that are like really great arrangers and orchestrators for live music? In other words, you're let's say that somebody gets asked to write a score, and there is in the score a big band moment, and they're not really fluent in that style.
Mm-hmm.
So, what kind of opportunity is there for those kinds of things?
Probably not enough to pay rent.
Like the score, like The Incredibles, right? The first one had a lot of.
That's a very, so that's a very. I was thinking because I'm friends with Michael Giacchino, and I actually went to college with his orchestrator arranger Gordon Goodwin, who's had a great career as a big band. He has Gordon Goodwin's Big Fat Band, and so Gordon, is the guy who got that score to sound like that score. I mean, it was obviously kind of based on James Bond scores, earlier James Bond scores. Monty Norman, who used a lot of big band in the early Bond films, and John Barry and how he kind of adapted it. So I mean, Michael is a good musician. He's a great musician. He's a great writer. Knows jazz pretty well. But Gordon is a consummate artist. But that's such a tiny, infinitesimal part of that relationship. Gordon is also a really, and by the way, I hired Gordon to do a big band project that I needed help with several years ago, and he's amazing. One of the video games that I did for Sony PlayStation, they only use one orchestrator for most all of their game scores, and happens to be a big band drummer. But look, a lot of the knowledge of big band arranging, translates into orchestration, although orchestration is such a great craft. By the way, the people who are truly gifted at creating very lifelike orchestral mock-ups on their computers tend to be people who actually know orchestration and understand more than the minimum about voicings and dynamics and balance. And I think that's a super valuable commodity. I by the way, I also orchestrated for a couple of years for a couple of composers. One of my best friends was an orchestrator, and by the end of a project, he was always in need of a little bit of help. So I got to orchestrate on some really good projects and learn orchestration that way.
You also learned it, though, by being involved in recording sessions and hearing. I'm assuming, I'm making an assumption, but I've got a larger point to make here, that you were doing all these recording sessions where you were adding synth parts to stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but like when you were working with Basil, is that how you pronounce his name?
Basil Polidorus.
Right. So you got to see that how he approached all these things. Or when you were doing recording sessions, you might have been in the studio with a lot of musicians, and you got to actually hear what things sounded like, what real
Oh,
players sounded like.
absolutely.
And that's
You
like sort
know,
of learning on the
my
job.
college years were filled with live music. I had two private teachers, one for, and they were both jazz musicians. For me as an instrumentalist, and one for me as an arranger and orchestrator. And so one of my very first jobs while I was still in college was writing big band charts for a music publishing company, doing sheet music, for high school and college big bands. I couldn't do that now if you paid me, if you held a gun to my head. I couldn't do it anymore. I've fallen so out of practice because it's just not part of my career. It's just never been a thing. I know the principles of it, but I'm too rusty with that. So I mean, the answer is that there's a interesting relationship between jazz and film. A lot of great film composers have some jazz background. John Williams was a studio pianist and played bass for a little while, playing jazz and working with in the jazz idiom. And he's written some great jazz scores. There's a fair list of composers whose background is jazz related, but the role of jazz in film, TV, and especially games is pretty limited. I think having a knowledge of some sophisticated extended harmony helps no matter what you're doing. It's probably better to know jazz than to know serialism, and 12-tone, inverted retrograde technique and all of that. Because jazz has a fair amount of adaptability to the language that often finds its way into film. So I think, as for those of you, how many of you are jazz musicians?
Like 95% of the class. I've got 3 undergraduate students, and then the rest are graduate students. Only one graduate student is a classical composer. He's studying with
Me.
Bruce Saylor. You're studying with, and then the rest are all jazz majors.
I really do feel that for all of you, take your jazz training, no matter what it is, and embrace it, but keep going. Think about, just look at what the top 100 movies of the last year were, which I think, by the way, you can Google plenty of lists of the top 100 movies, the top 100 TV shows, and the top 100 video games. And look at those lists, and then go listen to those soundtracks. And what you'll be looking at is an excellent predictor of what it is you're going to be asked to do. And honestly, it's not going to be, could you please write a jazz score for this film? It's probably going to be, write a score for this film. Write something romantic. That doesn't say anything about the style of music. Write something exciting, write something frightening. Write something memorable, write something funny, write something uplifting and inspiring, or some combo, that's the job. So my personal feeling about it is jazz is a great background to come from. But it's time to embrace what really is going on, because it is what's going to continue to come up again and again and again. And the question you have to ask yourself is, at what point would you tell a director, I'm not the right person for your show? That's not a conversation you want to have. I'm a big believer in the word yes. I really am. Embrace your curiosity and embrace your own desires as artists, as musicians, and be ready to fulfill those things. You know, can you write a really good spy thriller right now? Could you write? Could you do an animated children's film right now? Could you do a romantic drama right now? Could you do a comedy? Could you do something? Could you do a film about a heavy metal band right now? And the answer needs to be yes. And you know, the great composers that I know as my friends and colleagues, and back when they were my mentors, they brought a skill set. They brought raw musicianship. They brought the ability to think freely. And more than anything, they brought the ability to be open-minded and a willingness to try anything. With all of that skill set, whatever their skill set is, whether they come from a jazz background, a classical background, an electronic background, a rock background, you come to this job open-minded, ready to take all of your skills and apply them to something specific and unique. And at the end of the day, you succeed or fail based on your ability to embrace the challenge of whatever is sitting in front of you. So it's not about being a jazz musician, just like it's not about being an electronic musician or a classical musician or a rock or an EDM or an ambient or a avant-garde. It's not about that. It's about being a musician. It's about being a composer. And if somebody says, when the little girl comes onto the screen, I want a beautiful piece of childlike music, you know, like a nursery rhyme, but make it heartfelt and beautiful. And you go, yes. You know, talking to the one classical composer in the group, I have this very distinct memory. Some years ago, I was doing a workshop at the Aspen Music Festival. They have a substantial music academy, and they had a very small film scoring program for, I think, 5 students every summer, and it ran for a month, and I would go for a week. And one year, one of the students, this wasn't that long ago, this is like, you know, a dozen or so years ago. One time there was a student, a very gifted young woman, who was getting her master's, or I think her PhD in classical composition from, I want to say, the Eastman Conservatory of Music. So she was like serious, and she played me some of her music, and she knew what the fuck she was doing. She knew how to write for orchestra. She was very up on very avant-garde contemporary music. And that was her thing. And her feeling about scoring was, hey, I know how to write for orchestra and I want to make some money. So I'll do film scores, which is a horrible way to think.
No.
So we spent a day watching some clips that I brought from some movies. And I brought scores. And so we were looking at some scores, but mostly just watching these clips and then kind of talking about it. And there was this one clip, and I don't remember the film, but it was this very complicated scene in which we were cutting back and forth between a young girl getting ready to audition as a dancer at a conservatory and a crime, a rather violent crime. And we kept going back and forth because it turns out there was a connection between the two later in the film. And musically, it was an incredibly challenging thing to be doing these two things. And the way that score was laid out, and it wasn't by me, it was by a friend of mine, was he wrote this simple, beautiful melody played on a trumpet. And then the background was changing between these two things. But this trumpet playing this really pretty melody. And by the end of the scene, it was nothing but beautiful. It's just, it ended in this place of tremendous beauty, and it was very emotional and a beautiful melody. And I remember looking at that student, and I said, what'd you think of that music? And she just kind of looked at me. And I said, well, let me ask you this. I mean, I know you can write avant-garde music, but do you think you could write a beautiful, simple, and touching melody just like that? And I'll never forget the answer. She said, I could, but I'd never put my name on it.
Why would anybody hire somebody like that with that kind of an
Well,
attitude?
exactly. You know, let's just get it straight right now. None of us, not you guys, not me, are above the people we work for, who are willing to pay us, or even not pay us, but ask us to write music. You know, and I don't think about money. To me, it's not about that. It's really about being asked to do something by another person, and being kind of in an act of service, but also in a tremendously creative act. But it is about, you know, I can only imagine what the director of that particular clip had asked that composer to do. But, you know, it worked. Just like, you know, Gustavo Santaolalla, who's a phenomenal guitarist with tremendous skills in jazz and Brazilian music and classical music, writes the simplest, pretty little pieces that are just, they're trivial to play, and Max Richter does the same thing. It's not about dumbing yourself down. I think that was her perspective, was I refuse to dumb down my art and, you know, put on your knee pads and bow before my great capacity. It's far, you know, what's humbling is being asked to write a beautiful piece of music or a terrifying piece of music, and having it actually reach an audience. When you think about it, what it is we really do for a living is we create experiences. And nothing is more moving and touching than that simple idea that what you get to do is create experiences in other people. It's the reason art has ever existed, is to create an experience in another human being. That is, as far as I can tell, the best and only definition of art that I can think of. And even more so for entertainment. And we could get into a conversation about if film composers are artists or entertainers, but I'll tell you right now, it's a little bit of both, but mostly we're entertainers.
Well, I would take that, the classical composer, the young lady, not that she was dumbing herself down, is that she's not willing to be part of the team. And because if you're part of a team, you know, you could be asked to do stuff that's using 10% of your skill set, but you need to give it the same attention as if you were writing something that was, you know, this avant-garde piece that you were putting your whole existence into. You need to write this thing you're working on for the film. You have to have the same attention and detail to that, even if it's very simple, but it's not simplistic. It's, it's
a different muscle, you know?
Yeah.
It's a different, writing a score is a different muscle than writing a jazz piece or a classical piece or a rock piece or an EDM piece or whatever. It's just a different muscle, but it's still you. And in my opinion, simple is much harder than complicated.
Well, you know, in hearing you talk about this, it really resonates with me of thinking what it means to be like a jazz musician in these day and age anyway, you know, and you have these guys like Bill Frisell or even like Nels Cline or these guys who do great film scoring work, but they're not, you know, they're just great musicians. They just make great music, and trying to put them, or Terrence Blanchard or whatever, in a box being like, oh, you're a jazz musician is kind of, it's pointless anyway, you know, and that I feel like there's so much cross-pollination between those two worlds in thinking, you know, at this point, yeah, jazz has the improvising is kind of the biggest focus these days,
Mhm.
not necessarily like the aesthetics of jazz. So it's definitely, it feels like what you're saying, hits the same kind of angles as just being a musician in general today,
Yeah, I think so. I agree.
And I just had a
By the way,
quick
Nels Klein
question.
is just one of my favorite guitar players.
Me too.
I used to hire him when he lived in LA, but he moved to New York a long time ago.
Yeah. If you have time to answer a quick question,
No, I'm good. I'm good for a little while.
I was just wondering, nowadays, and it definitely feels like representing yourself in general is like a really important thing, like online and just in more than ever, like kind of figuring out a way to represent what you can do in an easy way is so important. And, we have familiarity with that as, improvising musicians or performers or whatever. But any recommendations you might have about finding ways to represent yourself if you start to want to get into this line of work?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. Let's talk about that. All of you should be working on your demo reels. Put them up on SoundCloud, do whatever you do with them. But all of you need to have really powerful demo reels. And a demo reel needs to show as much as possible of what you are, but specifically as it would apply to scoring. So in other words, if you have a goal to get work scoring, then you need to have music that feels like it came out of a score in your demo, which means it needs to be cinematic, it needs to be emotional. I'll say something that'll probably piss most of you off, and you're all going to hang up on me, and that's fine. Jazz has a very intellectual component to it, doesn't it? There is something, you go to a jazz club back when that was a thing, and you'd see a lot of people doing this. I would say that they were appreciating the music more than enjoying the music, because jazz is demanding on the listener. It has complexity, and it's shifting all the time. And film music is about the most anti-intellectual art form I've ever encountered. Nothing about it is intellectual. And it's all about emotions. A good demo reel should show how would you score the main beats of a score. In other words, tension and horror and uplift and just all the things, just all of those main beats, emotional beats that are such a mainstay of so many scores. Whether you do it in a more ambient style or more rock style or more classical style or strings or whatever, and do whatever you feel is an honest reflection. But all of you need to have scoring demos. And to be honest with you, I would omit anything that doesn't sound like it comes from a score. Meaning, you got to leave your jazz shoes behind. And that's tough because you've worked hard and you're very proud of your work in your genre, in your chosen musical genre. But that isn't what anybody is looking for in a composer to score. They're looking for that thing we talked about right at the very beginning when I came on. What makes something sound like a film score? What makes something, quote unquote, cinematic? Is it about making something sound big and huge and grand? Absolutely. Is it about making something sound intimate and tender? Absolutely. Is it about scaring the shit out of me with like one note? You bet. And so again, you know, look at the top 100 TV shows, movies, and games, and look at those scores and balance it out, and then think about how to bring you into that. And you know, to your point, Pete, if we just listen to the music from the last year or two, we are looking at what the future is going to expect to some extent. You know, things don't change on a dime. Things don't just flip. I mean, sure, Trent Reznor does a score and then suddenly you hear a ton of it, but that doesn't matter. You want to be authentic. You want to show somebody why you're better than somebody else. And by better, I mean more appropriate. And your versatility, your musicianship, and your production quality. Does your thing sound great? You know, get it mastered if you need to. Get somebody to help you mix it if you need to. Bring in soloists or ensembles if you need to. No excuses. The deal is no excuses. You can do more, you know, with GarageBand on a phone than anybody could do it, you know, 10 years ago. So, you know, I've written cues on a phone. It's not fun. Don't recommend it. But I've sketched things on a plane onto my phone in a moment of desperation when I didn't want to forget something. So that's I think the next step is every one of you needs to have a no excuses demo that says, this is me doing this, 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 and this. And hopefully you're the connective tissue, you know? You know, regardless of genre or style, forgetting style for a minute, each one of us, each one of you has taste. And that taste will steer you in a particular direction. And we'll say, well, when is this piece finished? When is this piece right? You know, does that bass line distract? Maybe we don't even need a bass line. You know, somebody once asked Brian Eno what he did as, you know, what his profession was. And he said, I'm a filter. And that's a great way to describe what a producer does. And we are producers, we're filters. You know, there's a difference between good and right. And in scoring, you're only interested in right, not good. You will be asked to write fucking stupid music from time to time, and you can still get it wrong. Or you can get it right, be the hero, and get hired onto the next job by that same person.
I have two questions.
Is that Latoya?
Yes.
Okay.
First question is...
nice microphone, by the way. You sound great.
Thank you for being with us today.
My blood pressure just went down.
How has your ability to build relationships changed from the time you first started to until where you are now? So your ability to...
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a track record now that I obviously didn't have starting out. So my music speaks for me. And I meet people who are interested in me because they heard something of mine that they liked. So I have a little less to prove. I also, I just have become more fearless over the years in terms of meeting, you know, look, I've worked with so many great filmmakers and TV makers and you know, people who I idolize, I've gotten to work with. And with each one of those experiences, I'm less nervous about the next one and being able to be myself and be genuine and, you know, maybe, you know, tell a joke at a unexpected time and just be myself, you know. And so in terms of relationships, I think I didn't take relationships. I think because of my fear, I wasn't as focused on relationships as I became later. Because, you know, filmmakers and TV showrunners and video game directors, they want to work with people they want to work with. And they want those relationships to have trust. you can't do that only in music, you know. It does really help to be somebody that they want to spend time with, you know. I've worked for directors who have, you know, confided some of their most intimate secrets, which by the way I don't really do back very often, but you know, I've gone through some tough times with some great people, and we've built relationships both professionally and personally. So it's a great question just about relationships. I do think that producers and directors can smell insincerity from a long way away, because it's the entertainment business and there are just a lot of bullshitters out there, and there's a lot of wannabes and a lot of fakers, and so the desire for not feeling hustled, not feeling like they're being sold something, but at the same time, you know, engaging over something, engaging in some way over music or their projects, their past projects, their future projects, whatever it is. So, you know, I've certainly seen composers, you know, approach filmmakers at parties or festivals or what have you, back when that was a thing, and just ruin it by just getting all up in their faces and, you know, not just being graceful about it.
You had a second question, Latoya?
Yeah. Well, real quick, I know Professor Calandra talks a lot about carving our sounds. Yeah, like my second question really is, when you don't quite have the rig you want yet, what are some things you can do? I've thought about, of course, hiring other musicians, and Professor Calandra talks about crafting the sounds and everything using envelopes. What are some other tools or tricks, like before you get that rig you really want to get the sound?
Well, I mean, I don't know really if all I had, so my the sequencer that I use is Logic from Apple, and I've been using it since like 2000, and I believe it costs $199 or $299.
About that, yeah.
And it comes with so many samples and so much stuff, between a sequencer that only costs a couple $100, filled to the brim with work, and the fact that there are free plugins and free sample libraries in abundance all over the internet. I don't even know what it means to wait for that rig, because frankly, if you have a laptop with even a modest amount of horsepower, you've got the rig. You might have to freeze tracks and, you know, go through, you know, bounce things and, you know, which I still do. I still run out of power on some projects, and I have to freeze and bounce and you know, go through a little bit of a song and dance. Not often, but I've never been held back by the amount of technology I had. Whatever I use, I know well enough that it becomes the total resource needed. And what's wrong with limitations? You know, I mentioned Stravinsky earlier. His whole thing was that without limitations, you can't feel freedom. So he'd say, I'm going to write a piece, I'm going to write an octet, and it's going to be these instruments, and whatever comes out has to be these instruments. And then would do something genius and Stravinsky. So I believe that you will always want more. You will always need more. There will always be the sample library that isn't on sale yet, and there's going to always be the plugins and reverbs. That'll never go away. But you have the rig you need. I don't want to sound flip about it. I just feel like you start where you are and you progress from there. But the technology is such that it takes so little you can do so much with so little. Just be creative. Do you feel held back by what you have in front of you?
Not anymore.
Good answer. I like that. Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Latoya is an excellent vocalist and keyboard player.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
I had a question. Earlier, you and Pete were talking about Basil Polidorus. My favorite of his compositions is actually Conan the Barbarian.
I worked on that.
Oh, you did? Oh, cool.
I worked on the second one. Which was first? Conan the Barbarian? No, Conan the Destroyer.
Destroyer was the second one. Yeah, Conan the Destroyer was the second one.
And then I worked on a couple others with him.
Yeah, what I liked, he had, the director and him worked together very, very closely about what the music should be, how it should be presented in the film. I'm just curious, like today, what's it like with the directors, and how much collaboration does the composer get in the creation of the film?
That's such a broad question, and the answer is there's no one thing. On the downside, a lot of the business has become very monetarily driven. People are not, budgets are low or stagnant for music. There's a new generation of producers who come from finance, and really their whole goal in life is to produce something for nothing. And music often suffers as a result, because it's like, oh, wait a minute, so-and-so said he'd do it for $1,500. So let's get rid of the $4,000 person, even though they have a shelf full of awards, and, it's who, So sometimes money gets in the way, but so many younger directors, look, most directors love music. There's just a high correlation of just being fans with filmmakers and game makers. They just listen to music and they love music. A lot of times, a lot of them go to a lot of concerts and love to, drone on about that ceaselessly. Whether or not as a composer you really are part of something beyond your little niche is very personal and very based on trust, which nobody starts with trust. And if I'm asked my opinion, I will give an honest opinion. And many times I've had directors decide to change a cut or take out a line or do something because of something I said. I've also had it where a piece of music that I've written that they liked the sketch, I've been able to, on a couple of occasions, be able to sit with the editor and say, can we make this scene a little longer, because I have this one sequence that the director really likes, and if I chop it up or speed it up, it loses that. And that's a big ask. That's a huge ask to change and edit. If I'm not asked my opinion, I do not give my opinion. And I am often, loved for my not giving my opinion.
I actually have a question that pertains to your composing, actually. So
I thought all of this was about that.
Yeah, but in film and TV, we as an audience, we are, in a sense, like we are forced to watch what is on the screen. But in video games, in a way, yeah.
You can
because
shut it off.
we see and listen to what's on the screen without any control of what is happening on the screen. But within
correct.
video games, there is an added element of the audience or the consumers controlling what's on the screen. So I guess my question will be, do you have like a different mindset when composing music within these different realms of media?
Absolutely. Film and TV, not much. You know, you can say that, you know, an average film is, you know, 90 minutes plus or minus 30 minutes. Well, plus 30 minutes. TV shows are shorter. So in terms of just structuring the arc of a score to match the arc of the story, it's a little different. TV also tends to, you know, there's a cliffhanger that then carries you into the next episode, you know, stay tuned next week. So, I mean, and, you know, going into commercials for network TV and, you know, venues where they've chopped the show up. And even TV shows that are on streaming, you know, services like Netflix or Amazon sometimes have commercial breaks because they end up on TV in other parts of the world. Not always. So I think there's a subtlety, there's a subtle difference between film and television. Budgets are different, timetables are highly different, and TV is it is a sprint, and movies are kind of a marathon. Video games, things really are different. There is a structural difference because like you said, the people creating the game are not creating the pace. There's no editing in a game. There's cutscenes and cinematics, and forget about those. Those, you know, are a really tiny thing, and those are just like little tiny movies. But in an interactive score, music becomes a modular asset. So a piece of music can be broken down both in the x-axis and in the y-axis. So let's say that the x-axis is time and the y-axis is stems, or, you know, the instrumentation. In a game, you are given a map, and it's usually in the form of a large spreadsheet that said, okay, level 1, if there's a cinematic for 15 seconds, then it goes to the menu. The menu has all these different outcomes, and then based on the outcome, you go to the first section of level 1. It starts off with exploring the world. Then there's a threat, a low-level threat of danger, then a high-level threat of danger, then a low-key battle, and then eventually you get to a boss fight. So you have these layers of emotion, of energy in the game. But how quickly you get to those is completely in the hands of the player. And if they're a lousy player, it could take a long time. And is the music going to get boring after a while, right? So there are some tricks. And the best thing you can do if you're interested in, how many people here have any interest in scoring games in particular? All right, handful, small handful. Oh, it's growing. Okay. There's a modularity in which the music is written in such a way that a given section of the game, you write a piece of music, but that music could be chopped up into sections, and each section is independently and seamlessly loopable. And those loops can be anything from 4 or 8 bars to 4 minutes. So you create this music that is loopable and modular. And that takes a little bit of getting used to. There's a few tricks about how you go from the last bar back to the first bar without drawing attention to yourself, and whether you have a cymbal roll or some kind of ornament or scale or something, which, by the way, the answer is you try not to do that. But then as you produce the music, you may have you'll have a series of buses, of stems. And you may have, you know, one stem that's very low energy, and then another stem that has more energy, and another stem that has even more energy. And then the software in the game, the software that makes the music interactive, can bring elements in and out based on gameplay. So there is a tool called middleware. And the one that is used the most is called the Wise Engine, WWISE. Has anybody ever heard of it?
No.
No. So go on to YouTube or, just Google Wise tutorial or Wise introduction and see what happens to a piece of music in order to be in a game. So when you understand how that engine works, then you understand how to write for games in a way that's highly musical, highly expressive, but highly interactive. And some of it has to do with what you let go of, and some of it's what you hold on to. So, I tend to write melodies that are a little more continuous because the melody track may be muted by the software, by the game, because the game developers may decide, well, we'll only bring the melody in as you get closer to that goal. But if you have a melody that stops for 4 or 8 bars and then comes back in, they can bring the melody track back in, but it's empty. So there's a little nuance in terms of that. And that's cool. It's not complicated, but it's mostly about thinking in this modular way of intros, an intro, multiple sections that have the ability to loop, energy levels, and you get into the nuances of some key changes or tempo changes. It gets a little complicated, but it is not it's not rocket science. But the key is just to have you don't even have to know how to use the software, which by the way is free. You can download it and just play with it. But just understanding what the options are that it creates is great. And there's a million videos of video game composers, and I'm in a bunch of those videos, talking about these things, about the musical challenges of interactive and immersive media. My feeling is it isn't that complicated, but there's a few things that separate the good video game scores from the less good.
That's great, because I don't really have any experience with game music, and it's good for the students to hear that.
Look, during COVID, when film and TV shut down, animation and video games have held up. So currently, I am scoring a Netflix movie, which they're shooting right now. And I'm just sketching and sending those sketches and getting feedback. And they're starting to build a little bit of a edit and they asked me to send them some music to cut to. But I've been doing, most of my time has been spent in video games because they adapted and everybody works from home. And one game that I started got pushed back a few months for certain reasons, because they needed to do motion capture with an actor and it just wasn't going to happen. So generally it's held up pretty well. I enjoy it. I enjoy scoring games. I don't play them well.
There was another question.
Yeah, I just have a question. Like, how do you approach a new project, and what is the first step? Also, like, I know that for Phantom, you were able to go in the submarine and like record some of the sounds. And
I sampled a Soviet submarine, yeah.
And also work with the cellist. So if you could talk about a little bit of, and so it seemed like there was definitely a line through the entire work.
All right. Well,
so like, do you always think the way, like in terms of sound from beginning to end, using the same sort of sound, kind of bringing the listener and audience into that kind of world, or like, and also what is the first step? And if you work with a team, if you work by yourself, if you could talk a little bit about that kind of stuff.
Well, that's a good question about process. And I know different people have very different processes, but there seems to be, my process resembles a process that I know other people do as well, which is you start by having very, very detailed conversations with the director and get a sense of what they're thinking, and I find asking a director to tell me the story of the show in their own words, but like get it down to like 2 minutes, like give me your capsule description of the story, and suddenly you start to see it through their eyes instead of just reading a script. I get nothing from reading scripts. I can't tell a thing. But talking to the actual filmmakers, you get why they're making that film. Making films, making TV shows, making games is incredibly hard. And if you don't have, there's a reason that people are driven to do this impossible thing of making a movie. So getting their take on it and what their thoughts are musically. In the case of that submarine movie that I did, the director really did not know what he wanted. We talked about submarine movies as a genre, and Das Boot, and Hunt for Red October, another Basil Polidor score, and Crimson Tide that Hans Zimmer did. K421, whatever it was, Hospital. Anyway, there are some submarine movies. Do they share anything? Just a submarine, really. But he really didn't have a thing except, it was a movie about two people who had a disagreement, but a Holocaust could have occurred if they didn't resolve that. And so, great, okay, tension. The movie was about tension. But then there's a story about his daughter who he left behind, the character played by Ed Harris. And so, there are all these elements. And then there was Russia versus, it was the Cold War. So there was Russia and there was the US. And the idea wasn't that it was a movie about right and wrong. It was about two people who had two different sets of orders, and there's a collision. So it was my idea to think about sampling. I was invited to the set and I saw this submarine. It's all hydraulic. This was before any microprocessors or anything. So it's hundreds, if not thousands, of valves and tubes and pipes. So I said, can I come back and bring some drumsticks and a little field recorder, handheld recorder, and just get sounds? And so we did. During a lunch break, I was given 45 minutes to have the submarine to myself, kick everybody out, and I could record. I had two friends come with me and we just did it. And so from there, and just like all of my scores, it begins with some amount of time just experimenting. Where am I going to go? What am I thinking about? Am I thinking about something with guitar? Am I thinking about something electronic? Am I thinking about something with orchestra? What feels right? And if it is, do I want to make it, atonal? Do I want to make it, minimalist? How am I going to solve this problem? So I sit down in my studio and, I'll do some sound design and do some custom samples like I did with the submarine. And I've done on almost all my projects create something from scratch so that it doesn't exist in any other score. It makes using commercial samples feel a little better to me. So it's like just having playtime. There's no pressure to come up with his theme or her theme or the villain theme or the hero theme. It's just, I'm just gonna make some noise and see what happens. I'm just gonna come up with some musical ideas. And I just start writing, and with no goal at all, I mean, I know the story, maybe I've seen bits of it, but my goal is just to see what comes out of me. And at some point, something will click. Maybe I write one piece, maybe I write 20 pieces. And I do them all in the same file, so I can jump around, tempo changes, key changes, meter changes, whatever. It's all in one file. I just put a few bars in between each, and I set a little marker. So I can jump from marker to marker and go through ideas and just keep building and building and building and building. Eventually, I feel like, wait a minute, that could be a hero theme. That could be a tension theme. That could be a good opening title piece. That could be this. So what I'll do is I'll start scraping some things out. And I end up creating like a 5 to 10 minute suite of short ideas, sometimes an idea with 2 or 3 variations, but don't belabor the, here it is a little faster, here it is slower, here it is with voice, here it is with oboe. I don't do that. I just come up with saying an idea that states my idea clearly. And then I take that little suite and I play it for the director, and I don't say a word. I don't say, oh, this was my idea for the main theme. This is my idea for the villain. This is my idea for this. This is my idea for that. I just say, I've written a few pieces. Would you like to hear them? Yes. If I can be in the room with them, that's great. Because I like to watch their face. Because I can see when they get bored, when they engage, and boom, I know where I've succeeded. I know where I've failed. And so inevitably, and this just happens 90% of the time, at the end of the 5 minutes or whatever it is, 10 minutes, we stop the music and they'll go, okay, yeah, I heard a few things in there that I really like. And there was that one piece that I think would be really great in that scene. And boom, I just started. Is there anything you didn't like? Well, that piece I just doesn't feel like it belongs in this movie. Gone. Anything else? No, the other thing sounded fine. I don't know where they'd go. Okay, we'll leave it at that. And there. That's kind of it right now. I try to do, so the idea is that the most pure part of the process is writing not to picture. You're just writing ideas. You're just writing themes and exploring things sonically, exploring things melodically, exploring things rhythmically, exploring things dramatically. From that point, once you start writing to picture, everything's a compromise. You're having to stretch things and cut things, and your favorite cue gets thrown out. They throw that scene out. Everything from that point isn't as fun as that initial suite that kind of kicks things off. So that's that.
Awesome. Thank you.
And then there's, then there's the actual writing. And I do have a team, and not to write with me, but to help organize and get sessions together and mix and do scores and parts. And if a scene gets recut and I'm behind, I might get somebody to get the music to work in the new cut. So sort of conform the old piece to the new cut. Just keep me on track. Keep track of what's been written, what hasn't. We have I have this spreadsheet system that I use for kind of noting. Was it written? Was it listened to? Was it approved? Are there notes? Was it rejected? Is it accepted but changed these two things? So staying organized is a major part of the battle. And if you're not organized, get somebody who is.
Thank you for saying that last bit. I say that.
Well, no, it's funny because a friend of mine who's a very gifted sound designer has been working with Ludwig Göransson, who's very talented, The Mandalorian and Black Panther and Tenet. And he said, boy, I don't know how that guy gets it done, because I've never met anybody less organized than this guy. And so he has a group of people around him who just keep him on track, moving to the finish line without, forgetting to write a cue or forgetting that they recut a scene and make sure you're working to the right picture. I've worked with a few people who are not hyper organized, so that's usually what a music editor is there to do, but that's sometimes not enough, and they're not here. My assistant works upstairs. He has a rig that mirrors mine, so anything I write is on a server, and then he can open it and do my demo mixes and polish things up for me while I keep writing other cues. Deadlines, yo.
Yeah, deadlines.
Nothing happens without a deadline.
So true. You'll never learn what you can do until you have a deadline.
Every piece of music in any film, TV show, or game that you've ever heard was written on a deadline and on a budget. Every note. No exceptions.
Right. Well, I think right now at this point, we're sort of at like towards the end of the class. We've kept you for almost 2 hours. So appreciate it.
Really?
Thank you so much.
It's been oh, look at that. It's been almost 2 hours. Wow.
Yeah.
Time flies.
Thank you.
I don't know about you guys. I had a good time.
No, what you've
It's nice to meet you guys. It really is.
What you've told them has been so important, I think, and really, really fantastic. Really appreciate it so much.
You know, I could have summarized all of this in something that my old agent used to say to students. She'd just say, "Don't bother." That's a great lecture.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. And also,
My pleasure.
Take care of yourself out there. It's a crazy world with COVID.
It is a crazy world. Good luck, everybody.
Thank you.